think the One Piece TCG has a very big problem when it comes to winning the game. And I'm talking about alternate win conditions specifically. I think the design of the game is going in a very specific route that I don't think is actually gonna lead to long-term success. And I think there's a lot of factors working against the game, and this is as someone who genuinely enjoys the game at large. I love the One Piece TCG, but I think as a Nami player, I have a very unique perspective of the game, and also as a long-term Magic the Gathering player, one who plays a TCG that has succeeded in many different routes in design, in set, in formats, and I think One Piece can really take from this to become a successful TCG. Now, of course, a lot of people have this opinion that because One Piece is a very limited IP, it's just one anime. It's not like the other different multi-cross anime TCGs that exist out there right now. I think it's important to note that ultimately the game can succeed because as long as the anime is going out there, as long as the IP is successful, and as long as the mechanics are clean and the gameplay is good and all these other factors, then it can do well. But I think there has to be some additions made, and that's what I really wanted to talk about today. I wanted to talk about my frustrations around the lack of, I think, intuitive design or lack of really good design around winning the game, and how I think that is going to lead to a long-term downfall in this game's playability and accessibility. And I want to first start this by talking about the casuals, where this might be a bit of a contentious topic, right? But I think it's true that many games succeed by catering to casuals, because the casuals are the ones that are going to come in and out of your game. They're going to try for a little bit, come back out, maybe they'll play with their friends, maybe they'll kind of hop back out and play something else. But what brings them back? What is the mechanic? What is the outlet that brings these players back to play with their friends and continue to try the game? I think ultimately that is the accessibility of the game, and that comes in the form of win conditions. How easy is it for me to win the game? How easy is it for me to pick up a leader in One Piece and continue to construct a deck that can lead me to the victory line, take away my opponent's life and get me there, or find an alternate way to do so? Now, when it comes to playing Nami, that can be really difficult. The deck is actually probably the most difficult deck to play in the One Piece TCG. It's very meta dependent. You can make a lot of choices and card changes based on what your locals are like, based on what you think a tournament is going to be like, and so it's very hard to perceive at a per game basis how good that deck is going to be. Obviously, there's favorite matchups and not, but ultimately the deck relies around mill, a term that comes from Magic the Gathering focused around mill stone, where that was the first card that referred to taking a card from a library and putting it into the graveyard on your opponent's side. And so Nami being a mill deck says that you win the game if you ever read 0 cards in library. Now, the beautiful thing about this deck is honestly the fact that you can win at what Magic players would call instant speed. So you can win in the middle of combat. If you were to draw out your deck in the middle of combat, even if you don't counter out that whole attack, it does not matter. You still win the game. And that is the beautiful thing about Nami, because that is the extra edge that you gain against a card game that really focuses around combat. And I think that's where the kind of real issue lies, that we have this alternate win condition out there that it's very clear that Bandai doesn't want to support. We have the Kabaji ban that was done very preemptively based on a rising metagame that was happening in the East, and so they didn't want the Western players to really take advantage of that all too bad. And I think it's completely fair that sure, ban Kabaji. I think there was moments in 04 and 05 where really Nami could have just ran away with things, but with the recent errata of Sakazuki and the onset of Moria and just a lot of the cards that have been coming out, it's clear that removal and being tricky is going to be really key. And I think with that in mind, Kabaji can come back, and there's a lot of anti-Nami tech out there as well, cards like Gion, and there's even other cards that when they enter play, they get you to shuffle cards back from your graveyard into your kind of discard pile back into your deck. And so everything exists to stop Nami. You can always tech against the alternate win condition, and that's okay. That needs to exist, right? And so ultimately there needs to be counterplay to that as well. Nami could be playing more removal to adapt to some of these things happening. And further discussions around sideboard formats and postboard formats can exist in the future as well. So far, One Piece is just one shot, one game. That's it. That's all you get to do. and even 1 mulligan. So there's a lot of uniqueness happening in the game. But because of that, I think that's why the game wants to stray away from alternate win conditions. It can feel very bad when you sit across a game and you don't have a chance to come back in a second game, play a 2 out of 3 where you could bring in a sideboard and tech against what your opponent is doing. You just come across the game, you have to be prepared for anything and everything your opponent is doing. So a lot of the decks play either all-in strategies, aka Nami, or they play very well thought out varied strategies, and they try and work with different options. I'm thinking of more so like Sakazuki, which is why it was banned. It wasn't a deck that necessarily had a high win rate versus the field, in the sense that it didn't do anything necessarily busted. It just had a lot of options, and that's what the leader did. It had the removal of black, the option select and control of blue, and then in a leader that constantly was able to select cards, right? You draw and discard, and that is what that deck provided to its combat, because then you could play any card you needed to in that situation to forward your combat and forward your game plan, which is a form of a win condition, right? You are controlling the game. Blue Black Sakazuki was a control deck, and then you have red aggro decks, which are the Whitebeard decks in many sense, which was brought down in many ways through bans and changes, but of course those bans were undone, and Whitebeard is technically back. For those Whitebeard connoisseurs, they still exist out there, but of course if black decks are everywhere, removal is everywhere. Heck, if yellow can shout off with 10 cost moms every turn, then they're gonna win the game as well. But with alternate win conditions, I'm kind of disappointed that the game is focused around just removing life, just kind of removing life points, attacking in, or whether it be through yellow's means of just kind of removing life, controlling what's there, blah blah blah. I'm kind of upset that that's what it is, and I say that because I think there's so much room for exploration of different effects, extrapolating some of the abilities that already exist in the game. Take, for example, Yellow's manipulation of life, whether it be removing for advantage or adding for disadvantage, whatever it might be. I think maybe there could be a win condition that exists around adding life. If you went up to 10 life, you could win the game on the spot. Maybe that's too high, but I think Vegapunk was the closest example to an alternate win condition that could exist in a yellow deck, where you're playing with a really low life count, but then you have this activated ability that can add cards to your life. And so that's a really cool kind of puzzle to build around. That deck obviously is going to require a lot of support in a field where, you know, red purple law is apparently really good and is going to get a lot of support. So maybe Vegapunk has his time in the sun, but I think that's the closest that we are getting to that win condition. So life is one way to gain a win condition. We already have the deck win condition, where if you mill out yourself, but what if we were to mill out our opponent? Every time the opponent takes damage, they mill over cards from the top of their deck, or every time that they attack, they mill over a certain amount of cards from their deck. And obviously if they draw from an empty library, they lose. And so this type of strategy could also exist, a true mill deck, not a self-mill deck like Nami, but a mill deck that forces your opponent to mill. And I think that could be an interesting archetype. There aren't many cards that support that right now in this game, but it's an option as well. And I think this type of exploration is really important, because as I was mentioning with that whole angle with the casuals, you need to provide options for folks that aren't just combat. It feels like right now there are only 2 things that you could do. You could play Nami or you can play combat. And when it comes to playing combat, you have roughly in every single meta game 4 to 5 top options, and really if you wanted to compete, 1 or 2, right? And so you buy into those meta decks and you're really doing the same thing over and over again. And when you really extrapolate it out, that can be said for any TCG, especially Magic the Gathering. You are focused into combat. There are alternate win conditions like Storm, Infect, and Mill, and all this different type of stuff. Cards that literally just say, I win the game. There's all that type of stuff as well, but the game has had years to develop. You see this in Yu-Gi-Oh as well, different cards being assembled together. And of course, a lot of this is very hard to extrapolate into the One Piece TCG because of its combat focused nature and because of its lack of turn structure, where you can do a lot of things out of order. I think there are interesting things that we could bring into the game itself to really improve it in terms of that turn order, where if you could say, where if you were to play a certain amount of cards before you attack, then you win the game, or you had to do something after you attack, and you kind of force these suboptimal things to try and create win conditions. I think the design space is there, and I think especially if we were to unify the East and the West, it would create that lack of certainty, where we wouldn't just have the East be this kind of proving ground for the West to then improve on afterwards. I think the unification of the game is very important, but also exploring alternate win conditions is also very important for the growth of the game, because you need different ways for casuals to enter the game and access ways to win. It can't just be combat. Other folks want to try different things. They want to port the deck that they had in Yu-Gi-Oh, in Magic the Gathering, in Pokemon, and try and replicate that in One Piece. And that's the reason why I played One Piece. That is the whole reason why I made this channel and started exploring different content. I wanted to see if a TCG had a mill deck, and then I played it and I saw Nami and I'm like, wow, this is literally perfect. It is the mill deck in this game. And of course it's self-mill, so my Magic fans out there will be, you know, will call me a hypocrite for it, but it's the closest thing we have in this game. And so I want other folks to experience this as well. I want there to be potentially a storm deck where you play a bunch of cards out at the same time and then achieve a win condition that may be restricted to a leader, where you have to have a certain amount of cards out and then you play these spells out and then you win. Or if you have all 5 of your slots on your board filled with these certain characters, then you win the game. And so if they have a removal heavy deck, or, you know, these cards, maybe they have conditions where if your opponents do things, then they get removed. And so there's different counterplay to it. And I think this type of design space is really important. We can't just have leaders that keep buffing your own characters. We can't have leaders that just keep adding to life totals, and like, there has to be different things, because ultimately this will just lead to power creep. We can't have red decks that just keep powering everything up, blue decks that bounce things, and black decks that remove things. Like, things have to mix and match and evolve and become better than what it is right now for the game to survive. And granted, there still is time for this to happen. There still is room to design and continue and improve the game of One Piece. But I wanted to kind of give this rant, and I just wanted to see what everyone thought. So what does everyone think about the design space of alternate win conditions in the One Piece TCG? Let me know if I'm completely off base. I kind of just wanted to throw this out as a general video of my thoughts and ideas, and just really wanted to see what folks were thinking in terms of the One Piece TCG. Is design space, do you think it's perfectly fine? Do you think the combat focus thing is just okay where it is? Let me know what you think in the comment section down below.